Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Universal Energies. My guest today is Demian Allen, who's an astrologer who I've known for a while, and we have bonded in different things that we do, from mind, body and spirit, fairs, etc, etc. I'm very honoured to have him here today because it's another aspect of the energies that I know you want to, and that's why you tune in and listen. So, good morning, Demian.
Morning, Robert, and thank you for inviting me.
You are quite welcome. Just to start with, we'll do a little bit about understanding your energies and where you come from. So, what brought you into this, my friend?
So I was born into a particular time when I think a shift was happened culturally in this country of England. I was born in the early 70s to parents who were very much involved in the mind, body, spirit way of life. My mother, she was a medium and a spiritual healer. And my father was very much involved in the Eastern philosophy and practiced transcendental meditation. And then we lived at a time when an awful lot of the esoteric was available, and the people that came into the home. So you'd have lots of books. Alice A. Bailey. Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah, wonderful.
Rider-Waite tarot deck lying around. So I was sort of bored into this kind of atmosphere, which seems sort of perfectly natural, and in fact one of the places that we lived in early on was a place that had a real history in terms of the First World War, where it was used as a hospital, and so we had lots of paranormal.
Where was that
activity? This was in Teddington, in Middlesex, what was then Middlesex. So there was lots of paranormal activity, there was lots of people experimenting, because it was a kind of a community that we lived in. And you as a child, you absorb that.
You do.
You do, and on both sides of my family it seemed to have been passed down. So it was always there, and around about the age of 14, I picked up an astrology book that my mum had on the shelf called Teach Yourself Astrology by Jeff Mayo. And I'd dabbled with the tarot cards and stuff like that, and it was one of those moments where I just sort of felt, well, I get this. I get this. The symbols, the language. And then of course you have to learn to construct a chart sort of by hand. Back then there was no kind of computers or anything like that. And I just became incredibly enthusiastic about it. And then a friend of my mother's, he had a girlfriend who was an astrologer, and she came over to the house and did my chart. And then that really kind of opened up the sort of the gateway, and I just kept on reading more and more books. I kept going to bookstores.
As you do.
And of course, you had back then you had quite a lot of sort of independent bookstores, so a lot of second-hand older books, and I really kind of just took it on board. And I mean, there was nothing in my consciousness to say, look, I'm going to be a full-time working astrologer. I mean, it just wasn't a job as far as I was concerned, or it was a kind of an interest that I had. And as I grew up and went into my 20s, it never waned. you know, I was still going to the book stores and still trying to find these books and everything else. I've got quite a collection. And, you know, I did the various jobs and did all the things that, you know, someone in their early 20s does. And around about the age of 26, 27, I had a moment where I was dissatisfied with the work that I was doing, dissatisfied with the way that my life was going, and astrology had been the one kind of constant sort of source there. And I thought, you know, I'm going to just take the plunge. I'm going to go for it. And as every sort of 27-year-old is and probably should be actually, is a slight arrogance. Because looking back, I don't think I was very good. But I took the plunge, and you kind of have to do that. And sort of, I ran a private practice for about 2 years. And what happened was everything kind of came together a bit. The people that came into my life, the clients, and just what we term as the kind of new age sort of movement. I mean, this is back in 1998, 97.
That's when I started doing MBSs with Chris Cousins.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of really started to explode then, and so obviously, yeah, I was looking for about 2 years, and then I sort of slightly came out of it. I felt like I needed more. I needed to learn much more. So I'd always still do kind of readings for people, but it wasn't full time. And I was working in kind of the theatre and stuff like that as well, doing directing and writing. That was my other sort of occupation at that time. And then back in 2005, I was sort of reintegrated back into that mind, body, spirit way of life. I wanted to again change occupation, and there was a well-known shop in London called Watkins Books, which is in Leicester Square, and I went there to apply for a job, and I got the job. And Watkins Books, if you don't know, is the oldest esoteric bookstore in the world, and was started by a man called John Watkins, who was best friends with Madame Blavatsky. And anybody who's been anybody in the spiritual world has been there. And I got the job, and I looked after the astrology section there, and I started to do readings again much more frequently. And that was a really good education for me, because it enabled me to absorb so many different areas of Eastern philosophy, yoga, to paranormal stuff, to theosophy, much more.
It's also a hub there, where you are, as a hub for different cultures, different, and they'll come to you rather than you going to them. Yes. Yeah,
and I've been working there. I'm now I work there as the astrologer now, doing readings. I've been there for a long period of time, and that's been a real blessing for me. And it's only when I kind of look back at all of the sort of shifts that have happened in my life that I realise what I feel is that what I do is what I'm meant to do. You know, there's just been a certain amount of things that have happened in my life that's allowed me to be a full-time working astrologer, which there aren't many of us around.
No, I was going to bring that up, but now you've nicely brought that question up. Why do you think that is? When we had our little conversation beforehand, we were saying that everybody's coming out to be psychics and mediums and astrologers. Why do you think that more people are open to doing these things now?
Well, astrology has had a bit of a difficult time historically, particularly in the 20th century, and one of the major problems was that, until 1989, it was illegal to do predictive astrology. And so astrology saddled up to the much more psychological approach, which is fine. And, I've done that work. And I think that there's been an explosion of psychics, clairvoyance. I think tarot is, there's a lot of tarot readers, and that's much more accessible in a way. Astrology is a vast subject that takes many, many years to study. And I'm not sort of putting it high above other divination practices, because
of course
I put astrology as a divination practice. However, I think that, I teach astrology now, and you have to really work with it. You have to understand the language. As I said, it's like, when you pick up a guitar, you have to know the scales, the chords. You have to get to know that basic structure, and then you can kind of go off and do your own thing. You have to know that structure. And that's like astrology. There's a certain structure you have, and certain rules and certain signs and symbols that you have to get to know. And it takes time.
Yeah.
And I think for what I find is when I do readings, particularly, I don't know. It must be some of the way I do the readings, but I try not to give the clients astrological babble too much. They don't really want to know if Mars is squaring Pluto.
I do understand that. There will be people who will want.
There will be, yes.
Yeah.
But mostly people don't want to know that. And so what's happened is that I think that astrologers have found it much more difficult, actually, to work in the way that psychics, tarot readers, clairvoyants work. Because it seems to be the normal, how can I call this, time frame. Like if you go to a Mind Body Spirit event, it's sort of 20 minutes for reading, maybe half an hour. And astrology needs a bit longer as well. So everything's become a lot faster. And therefore the astrologers have to work a lot faster.
But do you, without judgmental for anybody, do you find that astrology is more a fact-based situation, whereas a mediumship or intuitive card reading, if you like, is what you might perceive yourself through maybe intuitive pictures or words or something like that?
Astrology, a good way of putting it, is probably an intuitive science. As I said, it's a divination practice, and you can do the same job actually in astrology that a tarot reader or a clairvoyant or even a medium can do. It's just as accessible. It's just the way that it's presented,
Right.
I think. And a lot of astrologers have wanted to sort of be in the scientific camp or be kind of respected in the scientific community. I don't. I couldn't care less about the scientific community of how they accept me or whether they're not, because I can't say, astrology is a science, because I don't feel it is. It's a divination. So I think that standing up to the scientific community has had a detrimental effect to astrologers in trying to make it much more respectable. And we were discussing this beforehand about the work that we do and how people can have views about that work. If you say, well, I'm a medium, everyone has a view, and they more or less try and actually say, well, this is my view to you. If I say I'm an astrologer,
that's true.
People will go, oh, that's a bit odd, or well, do you believe in it? These kind of comments. And so I think what astrologers have had to try to do is try to make it academic, which it does have an academic basis to, which I think is good, scientific, and respected. Because in history, astrology has been in the past.
Oh, definitely.
And I think that what's happened now is that we are going through an explosion of the mind, body, spirit industry, and I do call it an industry now. And astrologers have to have a voice in that. It's important. But what you have to do is work within those structures as well. So if I do a festival, I have to work quite quickly with my astrology, because people's perception of a reading, and you might get this, Robert, is that there's a certain criteria that they're looking for. There's certain questions that they want answered.
Definitely, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And of course, we all work in different ways. So there's become a little bit of a set standard that's happening. And for me, I kind of feel a little bit my role is to kind of become the sort of slightly the bridge between that. It seems to be where I'm, put myself.
I've always found with you, Demian, is that you're genuine, and that's the thing that makes the difference to good or bad anybody. If your heart's in something, you'll put your whole self in it. If it's there for alternative motives, and a lot of them today, I have to say, and I'm not just talking about the psychics or the spirit workers of any kind, a lot of people today are and have to be ruled by pounds, shillings and pence, as I would say, and we would both remember them. But that's what they are today. Can I ask you just a little bit, as time is getting on, before we get onto your books, I'd just like to know a bit about your faiths and beliefs. Were you steered down a certain way, or were you just allowed, I know you said what your background is, to find your own way?
Yeah, I was pretty much, allowed to kind of find my way. The closest thing to a belief system that I follow is probably a Buddhist belief. I practice Theravada Buddhism and mindfulness practice. That's the way of life, So that's the closest thing that the belief system. But interestingly, I think it's an interesting thing. When I practice a lot of what I suppose you could call is medieval astrology, which is astrology particularly from the sort of 17th century. There was an astrologer called William Lilly who predicted the Great Fire of London, and he was probably one of the greatest astrologers that this country's ever produced. And he wrote a fantastic book called Christian Astrology. And his practice was an astrology called horary astrology, where you ask a question and you construct a chart for the moment you ask the question. And in his book, he does talk about the relationship with God. Now, whatever you see that higher force or force for a good, it does give a structure and a moral compass, which is incredibly important for the work that I do. I mean, one of the first things I say to a lot of my students is, look at the symbolism of the planets. Do not give your own opinion in a reading. You're working with these planets, their meaning, and you're working for a higher cause. As soon as you start putting your own opinions in, you're projecting.
Yeah.
And it may be that the person that you're going to read into, you have a very similar story or life story, and empathy is a great thing. But the planets and the signs give you a structure. You have to keep on that sort of channel. And what's interesting is that in Christian astrology, he goes on about serving God and serving a higher purpose. And bear in mind, this is written in the 17th century. And so I think, from my point of view, you've got to have this strong belief about serving a higher purpose than you. I think that's incredibly important.
I agree.
And one of the things that I do strongly believe in, and I always bring in with my astrology, is that the astrology that I practice is Western tropical astrology, which is based on the seasons. And there is, for me, nothing more beautiful or inspiring as nature itself.
I certainly agree with that.
And that is where you can gain a lot of spiritual wisdom and the cycle of life that we see through the seasons. And astrology is embedded in that.
You're very much on my wavelength. We're not calling the same things, Damien.
Well, people will go, astrology is the heavens, but it's not. It's here on Earth.
I do understand what you're saying, and I wasn't not meaning anything by that, but I was asking because my listeners will want to know and will comment and question me over this to find out that about your belief structures and how it was, and that was nicely explained. We now come on to your books and the books that you write for. So I'm going to allow you just to go on and just explain this by yourself.
Yeah.
Rather than me holding things up, and then if you want your covers up, you just put them up there and hold them up to the camera.
Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is my first book, which was published in 2012. The Astrological Dynamics of the Universe, 1970 to 2020. This looks back over the last just over 40 years at the cycles in this country and the USA, and predicts how the 12 signs of zodiac can cope with the next coming 5 years. It's a book that I wrote in a very, very short space of time. I had a deadline, which is always the best way. And it's a book that gives a lot of views on cultural shifts that we have experienced in this country particularly. Through film, through music, through art, through the political, through the economic situations, and how that has changed the landscape. And I've talked about the last, particularly from 2012 onwards, as being a bit of a crisis point for us on an astrological basis, and how we cope with that and how we deal with that. You know, because things are changing at such a dramatic pace, and that everyone.
2012 is a very prominent year, anyway.
Well, it's interesting because you know, of course, the Mayan calendar was.
Well, it's mentioned in the scripts of the Egyptians as well, and it's on their hieroglyphics. They talk about that.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that there is a shift of awareness, but within chaos. You know, people say, okay, we're at a higher state of consciousness. I'm not so sure about that, because I don't know if we're at a higher state of consciousness as people like, you know, Socrates and Plato.
I don't think we are. And quite honestly, I think that we've got a lot of work to do before we even touch the outsides of their knowledge.
Yeah.
Because what they were doing is they were talking about things that had happened, and they hadn't got an idea or a clue, but their scientific mind meant that they were leaps and bounds ahead of their own generation anyway.
Yeah. So, but I think that this is a lot of it's to do with also the construction of society in the Western world.
Yeah.
And the way that we live in a consumerist culture, and how that affects us as human beings, and actually, you know, not just in terms of adults, but, you know, children and the education of children. And this is, you know, I talk a lot about this in the book, and, you know, how astrology can. The cycles that we all experience through astrology can fundamentally give a really strong structure of how to bring up children into adulthood in a way that's not going to make them grow old too quickly, become a young adult too quickly.
I think that is quite prominent, just that phrase there, because that's what's happening today.
Mm.
And that's why we always get the situation with the youngsters where people will look who have a bit more knowledge than they think they do, and will say he's got an old head on his shoulders.
Mm.
And knowing their knowledge is quite right.
Mm.
And I find it's a very shame today that people get labelled for certain things because they're ahead of their understanding of knowledge that the curriculum the schools are giving out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a bit of a shame. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, it's fine. So, I think it's an interesting time. We live in interesting times, and I think there is a need to... Human beings need faith, I think, is an important part of the psychological, emotional and spiritual makeup of human beings, and that is what we are trying to find here. So yes, so the book came from an idea of from a magazine that I write for quarterly. This is called Mind, Body, Spirit. This comes from Watkins Publishing. I write political astrology, meaning that I look at the political cycles. Which is based on mundane astrology, which is a practice that was very popular. And so I give my my opinions 3 months in advance. So stuff like the general election coming up, which in May that was there. Predicted the result of that in the magazine, which I wrote about 4 months before it happened. So yes, it gives a kind of an overview of what to expect, because ultimately, no matter whether we like it or not, we are under the umbrella of the political systems.
Well, there's not much we can do about that, I'm afraid.
Well, there's an entirely different debate.
Yeah,
but
it's a different workshop altogether.
It is. So that's one magazine. The other magazine, which is probably more familiar, that I write for, was doing the horoscopes for, is Kindred Spirit magazine as well. And I also teach at the College of Psychic Studies, psychic astrology as well. So I have quite a busy...
You do have a very busy it's so good that you found the time to come here. Before I leave you, I just wanted to say that we see a lot of, in papers today and in the media, people do star signs. They just look at star signs, and they may have the stars, whatever signs they be, Capricorn or Cancer or Scorpio, whatever it is to be. And they look at those briefly in there, and we all know there's a number underneath. If you want more information, you've got to do this, that, and so on. But they will take that on board, a lot of people will do, and almost to justify what has either happened to them or in the past what has happened to them.
Yeah.
What is your take on the star signs that you have on in everyday life, in the media and the papers, etc.?
Well, I don't have a problem with them myself. I think there is different levels of astrology, and actually I think that it gives a voice within the media of astrology. We've always had sort of oracle systems for a long period of time in history, and it's like, I don't know, it's like listening to One Direction or Debussy. But it's still music. You've still got to have an opening there, and for some people it is the first point of contact with astrology. And I think that in that realm I don't have a problem with it. I write horoscopes, I have done for many years, and I look at it as it's in the same sort of thing as pop culture. It serves a purpose, but it's a very small percentage of astrology. But it gives a window opportunity for people to look into.
I asked the question because I know that there'll be listeners out there who want to know about the star signs and how it's related to and how we can move on from there. So they've now got their answer.
I mean, it's 12 archetypes, and I think for a lot of people, it's a bit of fun, and it depends on how those horoscopes are written. as well. But I don't, as an astrologer, I don't have a problem with them at all.
No, I've never had a problem with anything that appears, apart from whether when there's certain things that it's done for the self, and then we can see the difference. But apart from that, I have no. As far as I'm concerned, we were talking earlier on about the seed, as you said, the seed. Once that seed is planted, it will come to fruition and blossom when that time is right for whoever.
Yeah.
But for now, Damian, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Robert, for having me.
I can just ask you, now you're on air, you said you'd like to come down and do something at the centre.
That's right.
So if I gave you a ring or an email in the next month or so, and we perhaps can arrange something.
That'd be a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you very much.